We believe with this project, hopefully we can show you that it's completely viable to balance the facilities and infrastructure that's required for modern productions and performances with the amount of technology used in lighting, audiovisual and staging and rigging that can be in place in these older historic venues. Gobsmackingly gorgeous is the quote that was given by Philip Bernays, the Chief Executive of Theatre Royal Newcastle. And obviously you can see he's definitely referring to our design team and not the actual venue. With me today, I'm very, very lucky to have Peter Hall on the end, who was the project architect from Sansome Hall Architects, Dr. David Wilmore, who was the historical theatre consultant from Theatresearch, and Mark Priestley from Unusual Rigging, who was one of the contractors. So Newcastle Theatre Royal is one of the leading large-scale receiving theatres. It hosts a range of companies throughout the year, including the RSC, the National Theatre, Opera North, Rambert, and various plays and musicals from the smallest up to the biggest kind of Sound of Music style. The original theatre opened in 1837, I believe. David will probably correct me. And there was a fire in 1899, ironically after a production of Macbeth, which may hold some weight in that superstition that comes around the theatres. It was reopened in 1901 with an auditorium and front of house designed by Frank Matcham, probably one of the leading theatre architects, Peter excluded, of the day. So the main aim of the project really was a full refurbishment from the safety curtain forward to try and make sure that we were being historically accurate in restoring Matcham's original design. It took approximately 2.5 years of design development and a very, very short 7 months on site at a cost of around 5 million. The timescale was deliberately minimal to try and ensure it was as efficient as possible, really, to make sure that the theatre didn't have to go dark for a day longer than it needed to. As I'm sure you'll all understand, in this kind of current economic climate, that's very important, bums on seats. As I said, the ethos of the project is the historical reconditioning and refurbishment of the auditorium, but with an aim for an improved comfort and levels and experience for the audience, and in additional technical facilities to really future-proof this building. So with that, I would like to pass on to Dr. David Wilmore, who will tell us a little bit more about the process. Do you want me to bring up your...
Yes, please. You do the technology. I only do mahogany and brass and things like that.
Just press space.
Right, fantastic. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a quick whirlwind look this afternoon, obviously, because we are limited for time. But I just wanted to pick out one or two specific elements of the work. And there'll obviously be opportunity, hopefully, for a few questions, and we're quite happy to talk afterwards, sort of casually, and answer more questions. But I'll give you a quick whirlwind tour of sort of the project and some of the issues that came about as a part of the process of the design itself. John, yes, absolutely right. 1837, Benjamin and John Green, the original external statement of the theatre, which is quite unlike most theatres because it's an island site. It's absolutely making that architectural statement about what Newcastle aspires to in that early part of the 19th century when Richard Granger redesigned the whole layout effectively of the city. This is a finished photo of the project. There was a scheme for external floodlighting to enhance the main facade here in Grey Street. Grade 1, of course, listed building. And really the impact that Matcham made to the exterior was relatively small, although he did add what we colloquially refer to as the railway carriage, much like the railway carriage at the Royal Opera House in 1901 to extend the facilities. And he added these lights, which were, in the sort of middle of the 20th century, reversed around to the back, sort of pointing inwards. And so one of the things that we did was to bring these back onto the exterior. No doubt they were reversed simply so they weren't trashed by wagons and things passing the theatre, because it was only recently pedestrianised. But that sort of turns that back to a sort of more Matcham-esque feel in the way that he articulated the original 1837 auditorium. Looking for archive photographs are always difficult, none more so in this particular case, and we looked around in all the usual places. Eventually, this was one of the most interesting that we came up with, which was from Robert Arthur, the then theatre manager's sort of portfolio. He published a book on all his theatres. He was running theatres in Dundee and particularly in Scotland, as well as this one here. John's right. The Walter Emden Auditorium burnt down in 1899. It was, to all intents and purposes, not terribly liked, I think. We won't go into the reason behind the fire, but it's probably one of those that didn't work terribly well. In fact, on opening night, the sightlines were so bad in the gallery that they then closed it for 6 weeks to redo the gallery. This is what we see around about 1901 when it opens, and we can pick up various issues which we'll come back to. Paintings that have been lost in these plaques here, decorative tile work in the auditorium for, yes, aesthetic purposes, but perhaps also to just give the acoustic a lift underneath the shelf of the dress circle, and various other issues like that. And it was about assembling a whole multitude of pictures together. This one here, a Howard and Wyndham picture when the theatre was managed by Howard and Wyndham. We can see that some of the drapery has changed to the sort of 20th century style, but by and large the architectural intervention in the auditorium has been relatively little. One of the things that I particularly wanted to look at in this scheme was to reappraise the auditorium lighting. It had been altered on several occasions throughout its life, and what we wanted to do was to actually go back to Matcham's original concept. Incredibly, we were very, very lucky and discovered, would you believe it, and this is real anorak stuff, the original wiring diagrams for the theatre for 1901, the actual original drawings, which were in the IEE archives in London. And this helped us to actually make a calculation on how much light there was in the auditorium in 1901, and that in itself was absolutely fascinating, as well as telling us how it was circuited up, how it all worked, basically. These pictures are actually from the English Heritage Archive. They're off glass plate, and so we were able to blow quite a lot of them up in order to enhance detail as we went through. Sadly, not time to show all that now, but one of the pictures that did survive was this one of the auditorium ceiling. And by enhancing it, we were able to realise, and using the descriptions in the era of the stage and all historical contemporary descriptions of 1901, that in fact the ceiling had been absolutely smothered with light fittings, and all these little red dots are sort of my initial stabs at what and where all these original lighting positions were. And indeed we could tell when these were enhanced where they'd all been. So we wanted to go back to this. Obviously, the reason why they'd taken it all out was simply because, imagine trying to relamp that with conventional tungsten. It would have been an absolute nightmare. And so they'd reverted at some point in the 20th century to just doing it with a number of chandeliers. This in the centre here is the remains of the sunburner, which, again, I'll come back to in a minute, but this was a central feature that not only lit but also ventilated the auditorium and was in itself also an architectural centrepiece, so to speak, of the auditorium ceiling. So it was all about looking at these elements. We found original drawings of the actual sunburner itself, and this is the piece. This is the stuff that goes above the auditorium ceiling. This is the bit that actually goes, should have been there. This grille remained, and then a crystal chandelier had been hung from this point. So what we wanted to do was reinstate the architecture of the sunburner, not convert it back to gas. We didn't want to burn the building down again. But nevertheless create this sort of central focus. And again, we were incredibly fortunate with the project in that we discovered over 50 Frank Matcham original drawings, which started to tell us all about what he was intending to do with decoration. We identified here a lost arcade down the side of the dress circle in timber that had been destroyed. We found that there was complete tiling up and around the stalls here, which I'd mentioned before, and lots of other lost details, which with paint analysis and reconstruction, further physical investigation, we were able to put into the programme for reinstatement. This is actually an enhancement of one of those black and white photographs that I have shown you, and I put this one in for two reasons. One, it started to tell us that here was a missing mural, originally painted by Binns of Halifax, which we were able then to reinstate. This was just a blank panel. It also told us that, in fact, with the Matcham drawings, these were all soft surfaces, not hard surfaces. These were all upholstered with original mohair, and so that was part of our philosophy, to bring back these soft surfaces as well as the hard surfaces to get these contrasts back in. And this is Frank Matcham's solution to front of house lighting. And here originally would have been a very small carbon arc follow spot or something very similar to that, and a little man sat in a booth. So even in 1901, the light is starting to progress front of house in these areas. A quick flick through, because I'm desperately up against time here, of kind of things that finally achieved here. So this is a view from the stage of the completed job, a reinstatement of the carpet design, the tiles around the side. We weren't ultra faithful to Matcham because one has to make these buildings fit for the 21st century. And Peter came up with a fantastic solution whereby the wheelchairs used to come in here down the side street, and clearly we wanted to bring them in through the foyers. And so by bringing back a concept of a Matcham barrier at the back, we were able to introduce a ramp at the back, which allowed wheelchairs to come down and come through the main foyer, bringing back the sort of datum level difference between the foyer and the actual auditorium itself. Provision for, with the help of Charcoalblue and unusual, the front of house lighting positions, which I'm sure Mark will talk about, as well as the reinstatement of this arcading here. A bit more detail to show on that. Here we see one from the side here, where you can see this really chunky woodwork, which there was fortunately one of these pillars surviving. This one here survived. And so we were able to take the vocabulary from that and translate it into the actual reality. And here you can see again the attention to detail with these mohair panels that contrast quite vigorously, really, with the timber turnings and decoration. Well, a house full, you can start to see the lighting in this one and the previous one. These are all achieved with LED lighting, with a 3-colour LED, which is dimmable. It's really cutting-edge technology. It's still moving forward, as I'm sure so many of you know, and it has been, to a certain extent, a struggle. It's not been an easy birth to bring this in, but it does give us the wonderful advantage of not having to worry about having to re-lamp them every week, sort of thing. And we can go back to this original colour. And with having the cold light, warm light, and an amber in it, we were able to get the colour mix to achieve a colour temperature akin to that of the original tungsten. The light fittings were, again, recreated based on the photographs, and we worked very carefully with some manufacturers. We did also introduce 1 or 2 new elements. This is a box at the back of the dress circle. The sightline is probably just a little bit better than what you see here, because this is taken at the back of the box and stood up, whereas you'd be sat. But it also, again, provides us with wheelchair access into the boxes at the back of the auditorium. It's not an original feature, but it did soften the impact of the technical control room that was inserted into the dress circle in the 1980s. This was a very strong presence before. By adding the boxes at the back, it continued to have a symmetry about it that it didn't really possess before in a soft manner. And we took the vocabulary of this from Matcham's other work, including this, the Theatre Royal Wakefield, which we're now just about to start work on that auditorium as well. The seats in the auditorium were this delightful Dorchester from about the 1930s. There was insufficient money to refurbish these in the 80s, to replace them in the 80s, and so they were refurbished. And we worked to look at bringing back this 19th century style seat, which has been put together and designed by Josette, and this is based on the A.R. Dean catalogue of the period. There are hundreds of designs that A.R. Dean produced at that time, but we worked from their catalogues to produce a design that's ergonomically good for today, but has very much an architectural sort of ambience of the late 19th, early 20th century. Well, lashing on, here, front of house, these carpets are again rewoven from admittedly black and white photographs. We were able, however, to use scale because the architecture is still there from the photographs. We didn't find the picture in the auditorium of the carpet in sufficient detail, but in '86 they sold the casual chairs that were original to the Theatre Royal, and we managed to find one of these chairs that was on one of the photographs. And by finding the chair that was sold in 1986, we were able to get the scale of the pattern off the black and white photograph and then have the carpet rewoven. So it was about that sort of extra edge of detail and going that extra mile that brought these sort of original authentic features with soft cushions, soft furnishing here, brass stair rods, the careful restoration of the mahogany panelling and the white marbling here, the introduction once again of Lincruster wallpapers into public surfaces to give it that relief, that rich relief that it really didn't have before, and feeding this down into the foyer with complementary new murals commissioned, and the really rather clever solution by putting these mahogany entrances into the auditorium, we were able to introduce this ramp and remove, as it were, the lobbies that were inside the auditorium previous by pushing these lobbies into the foyer. This meant we could reclaim the Matcham volume at the back of the auditorium, and we've achieved just about the same seating capacity as prior to the actual work that we've undertaken. Nevertheless, the quality of the seat has improved massively in terms of where it is in the auditorium, and therefore Philip's gross box office on a night is significantly increased. So although there are not more seats, there are actually more better seats in the house. This includes the reintroduction of the amphitheater at the front of the gallery, which is significant, was originally a technical lighting trough, which I'm sure Mark will mention, and has now got a truss, so we've got those seats back in. We've improved the sight lines by going back in some areas to sit on the tier seats rather than tip-ups as well, and the whole of the 1972 carcass that was overlain on the gallery was completely stripped away, and we went back down to the lower Matcham sight line. There was a lot of jiggery-pokery to do. Peter worked absolute marvels in a very short period of time to get these seats in. What we do learn, and kind of my little orange box for today, is that when you're working with these historic theatres, you have to go and look at them and work with them, not against them. And sometimes you can't always meet every reg and every requirement of the public today. But you have to kind of not assume that one size fits all. Historic theatres were built in a different time. They need a slightly different approach. And sometimes you have to be creative in the way that you work to gain solutions that are acceptable for the 21st century, but also keep within the spirit of the Matcham work. And I think I've probably overrun already, so I'll hand over to Peter. Thank you very much. While he's coming, just put this picture in, just because I thought you guys would like to see it. It's not there anymore, but it was the Grand Master that used to be at the Theatre Royal in Newcastle. We found the photo of it. I worked this lighting board in the late 70s because it had been transferred to the Tyne Theatre. And before the fire at the Tyne Theatre, it was given away to Welsh National Opera. I think it's somewhere still down in Cardiff.
Need to run that? Or I just...
There you go. And if you press right. The right hand.
Right hand. Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Peter Hall of Sansome Architects. As David rather over-egged it in some description of what I did, but anyway, I was effectively the project architect on site. We had to do quite a lot of work to try and match David's aspirations as a full restoration project on this one, which meant that the working that we undertook on site was pretty intensive over a fairly short period of time. So, for instance, I moved to Newcastle, which is an interesting experience if you're not from there in the first place. But what I was going to concentrate on today was just to go through the title is Gobsmackingly Gorgeous, but what we did was the grubby bit, really. What we had to do was to get back to Matcham, and then from there build up an answer which would meet the Matcham requirements of the original theatre, but at the same time meet all the new requirements which we were asked to produce. So there is a sort of slideshow which I will just occasionally hit. It doesn't relate to what I'm saying. What it is, it's a series of photographs taken during the works. They're all black and white, so it's got a nice sort of age to it, but they are just illustrations of what we were doing while we were there. So I'll just... Every now and then I'll flick on a few, and please don't try and relate what's up there to what I'm saying, because it won't match. However, the overall challenge of converting this building, as David said, was something which meant that we were addressing particular issues about accessibility, simplifying the way you could use a theatre, but at the same time trying to keep the main Matcham elements. So you can almost take this sort of level by level. Down at the stalls level, we couldn't take any liberties with the floor. The floor is what it is, and the rake works reasonably well. But the whole business at the back of the theatre, we had a sort of code for it on the job, which was grid line 8, because that's referring to another theatre we did where all the problems were in grid line 8, and it was the back wall of the auditorium. And this one was the same. Grid line 8 is always the problem. You've got a whole series of interrelationships between circulation and the old building, which you've got to solve again. And what we looked to do on this one was to simplify that relationship. So you didn't have a series of small lobbies and things which you would go through. You would just go simply into the theatre. That was our ambition. Now, one of the problems with Theatre Royal is that it's asymmetrical. It's got a beautifully symmetrical facade, which is lovely for Newcastle, but the theatre doesn't sit directly behind it. It's offset. So when Matcham had his scheme, his whole front lobby system worked quite differently. And of course, he had all the separate access points, which took you directly to his areas of the theatre. So we had to try and make the common areas work for every level, and that's what we attacked from the beginning in terms of our design process. At the stalls, as David has mentioned, we took out all the lobbies which were previously inside the stalls area, and we built these small joinery item lobbies on the outside where it was actually in the foyer space, which meant that the back area was completely clear. And the main benefit that we saw in that was as you came through the door, you would actually come straight into the auditorium. And what we also did in that area was we reintroduced a ceiling. This is good, isn't it? Because this has got nothing to do with what I'm saying. However, you'll get the flavour of what we were doing as these would just keep running. At the back of this, you may have noticed on the section which David put up on the screen, there was originally a vaulted ceiling at the back of the stalls. So we put the vaulted ceiling back in because we could clear away all the lobbies. So you get the benefit of going back to an original feature because you've taken the steps to make it simpler in that area. So we carried on that basis through each level of the auditorium in turn. So down at the stalls level, there was a whole issue at the back of that area, which we addressed. And then at the front, and Mark will refer to this when he has his turn, there was a whole technical issue as to how everything worked in relation to the stage. And those are the two areas at the stalls that we addressed. Beyond that, we go up to the grand circle, and as David's lines is normal, there was the arcade, which we reintroduced. And we used that arcade as a very strong feature to enclose what was basically always had been Matcham's tiering in that area. So we were reusing his tiering, which was a timber tier, just as it stood. And our work was around the edges. Going up another level, it's not that, but going up another level, it's good. At the upper circle, things got more difficult. In this theatre, the upper circle was always the most uncomfortable area to sit, both in terms of the seating itself and also the air conditioning and the comfort value of being there. And we changed that significantly with going back down to Matcham's tier, reintroducing his layout, i.e. a central aisle and two side aisles. But then we had one, we took out a row of seats. Now, this was obviously contrary to our brief in that we wanted to keep the seating numbers up, but we had another scheme for doing that. So we took out one row at upper circle level and created an ambulatory across the back of that level so that we could get over the fire escape problem, which has been bedeviling Newcastle ever since it was first put in, because all the fire escapes are on one side because of this asymmetry. So at upper circle level, we went back to the concrete tier. We took out a row of seats, but we managed to just about get a bit more legroom. It's a touch and go, really, at that stage, whether we got more legroom or not, but we just about managed it at that level. Then we went up to the top level, the gallery level, and this is where the main changes occurred, because at that level, we found that the timber tiering which had been put in at various stages after the Second World War, really, had lifted the whole seating positions by up to 700 millimetres, which is a very significant change to the actual sight lines and the feel of how that gallery was. So we stripped it all out. We took all the old tiering away. We found underneath the tiering bags full of concrete, because the people who'd had a previous go at it, when they chipped away at the concrete risers to put their framing in, rather than carry this concrete all the way down to the street, they just put it in a bag, put it on the tier, and then built the tier over it. So it was all still sitting there, so we had a little extra there, which was to carry all this stuff down to the street and get rid of it. However, we did that, and we went back to the tier itself. And interestingly, at that level, the original tier was still there. We found the polished timber plank that people sat on. I mean, when Matcham did that gallery, he had 700 people up at that level, and they were packed in on every tier, sitting on a plank. And that nicely polished plank was still there in some instances, and the red-painted concrete riser. Very crude construction, but it was still there. So we've used that to build up our tiering. So we've lowered all the seating, which gave a better sight line. But one of the reasons the previous tiering had been put in to raise it, we believe, was because of putting all the technical lighting into a trench immediately behind the balcony front. So our ambition was to put the amphitheater back. Clearly, having 3 rows occupied by light fittings is not an ideal situation, and it divorces the people at the top of the theatre from the stage and from the rest of the body of the theatre itself. So we wanted to get that seating back. So we took the lighting away from there and left Mark and his boys and Charcoalblue to solve how they would get the lighting back into the theatre. That's their problem. Just get on with it. And we put seating back into the front 3 rows and then put in a new barrier that would be right across. But of course, in Matcham's day, the barrier was literally right across to separate the amphitheatre from the hoi polloi on the benches behind. And so the hoi polloi came up right to the top of the theatre and then came down into the gallery. Our problem with our very picky audiences these days is they want to come through the foyer system. They want to come into the theatre from the front. So what they did was create this problem for us. How do you get from what is effectively amphitheatre level back up into the gallery? And it's a very steep gallery, so the actual physical solving of that transition from the entry level and up the rake was something which taxed us considerably at the time, caused a lot of heartache. But eventually we got there. We got to the position where we have now got 3 really good seating rows in the front, which is now recreated the amphitheatre. We've put back the decorative screen immediately behind those 3 rows to separate it, and then we've used every other tier on the original concrete tiering right up to the top to get the gallery seating in, and all that is now on tier seating rather than tip up. So that we've gone back really to the similar sort of treatment to that upper area, kept the numbers up and gained all the area which is actually the amphitheatre, and that's where our seating numbers came back up again, so that when we take the overall total, we're somewhere close to the figures. In fact, we are slightly more. If every seat was in and all the wheelchair positions were taken up, the seating capacity is now 1,578, I think, which is slightly more than they started off with when we first arrived there. So the gallery was probably the biggest nightmare. How far have we got with this? Not very far, have we? Okay. There you are. Look, that's almost it. That's the transition in level between coming in and getting down to the amphitheatre when it was being framed up. It was difficult to do. Do these actually read? Okay. Yeah. Right. So basically, within the auditorium, we went back wherever we could to get to the Matcham structure, which was there. Having got to it, of course, the Matcham structure is not terribly clever. It's a clinker concrete. It doesn't take any load in itself. We had to use fairly substantial construction on top of it in order to give ourselves a sound base. But having done that, we have now, we think, gone back far enough to give most people within the theatre a really good set of sight lines, which was Matcham's achievement in the first place, and we would have let him down badly if we hadn't achieved that. David's touched on the whole business of the lighting, the sun burner. We had great fun with the sun burner because we thought we'd found one in Wall's End, which was being taken out of a theatre, it was being demolished. And we went and reclaimed it and brought it back and measured it, and it didn't fit, which was such a pity, but the dead pigeons fell out of it, and it had all that sort of patina of age about it. So that was sent down to London and used as a model for developing the new one, which has been a great success now and is a real appropriate centrepiece to the ceiling. So it was a real struggle. We were working on it continuously for a good 6 months, but in the end I think it's worthwhile. it's been very well received by audiences up there. I would recommend any of you who haven't seen it to go and have a look. It is gobsmackingly gorgeous, and therefore I think we've succeeded. And I'll hand over to the technical people to talk about how it was done in detail. Thank you.
There.
Yeah.
Space bar. Okay, I'm Mark Priestley from Unusual Rigging, who had responsibility for this project. And Unusual had have a good relationship with Theatre Royal Newcastle, in that in 2005 we did a lot of work backstage. We put a GRP grid and a new flying system in as a side effect of them wanting to build a side stage, so the existing flying system had to rise. As far as this project went, it was one of our more interesting ones in many ways. There were quite a lot of tensions in that the word restoration. The things that we were doing obviously didn't exist in 1901 in the main, and therefore it was interesting to come up with technical solutions that actually are sympathetic to everything that David and Peter were trying to do. And also it's a #1 touring house, very successful #1 touring house, probably one of in the top rank in the country. And therefore, if you start fiddling around with lighting positions and things like cross booms and all of that sort of stuff, it really gets people's backs up when they try and tour a show in there. So I'm sure John will speak a bit about this as well, because through the design process prior to us going in there and putting the new stuff in, there was a lot of discussion about how those two apparently insurmountable objectives could be brought together. Our other problem, because as has been mentioned previously, it was done in a very intensive short period of 7 months. For much of that 7 months, the place looked like this. And as far as trying to put stage engineering and lift systems and things like that in there, it's very difficult, as well as access, getting to the different levels and things like that. So our main installation period was mainly towards the end, and roughly about 6 to 8 weeks. So everything that I'm about to show you. So I suppose our trickiest issue in terms of the restoration versus a #1 touring house is the simple thing, the balcony front lighting bars. Obviously they didn't exist. You saw David's pictures earlier in 1901. How do you put those on there so they don't clash with the house lights and they don't clash with the plaster work too much, and actually appear to be as invisible as possible, certainly in that mode, before anybody rigs any lights on them. And I think what's there has been quite successful in terms of it's a sort of modern, very simple design, and therefore doesn't attempt to take anything from the Matcham ornate plasterwork or the decorations, and therefore sort of contrasts very nicely and is very simple and is what it is. They look quite simple. But one of our biggest installation issues was actually installing those, because just about every one of those is different, because every part of the curve of those balconies is different. And behind the plaster structure, there is very little steel work, so we had to put steel work in, and we had to survey one by one, not only the individual position, but so that also when you look at that picture, they all actually look as though they line up, which is obviously pretty important. So that was one of the first things that we did on the project. They went in relatively early, whilst people were riving the backs off the balcony fronts, and we could get in and do welding and things like that before, obviously, seating, carpeting, and all of that came in. One of the big issues in terms of technical versus restoration was to get rid of the Pross lighting booms. Now, what had been there, and people who've been into Newcastle will remember this, for a long, long time there were two triangular tri-light towers either side of the stage, which nobody liked very much, and obviously detracts intensely from the pros. So what was decided was that the first row of boxes would be given over to technical needs. Previously they had been sold, but obviously the sight lines are pretty poor from there. And so we created a whole system of frameworks. Again, every box was different, every back wall is different, and in fact in all of that plaster work that you can see there is very, very little structure. And the original idea was that most of this would be supported off structure that may be behind the plaster work somewhere. And obviously in the installation period, we found that actually there isn't very much structure, only at floor levels, nothing in between. It's all basically scenery is what you're looking at there. And so we invented a frame system that sits behind the drapes, inside the box, and then through the drapes come various different rails. And this particular photograph, you can see those rails being load tested. So that we have arms that come off that can do a boom here. And we've got, if you look carefully, speaker brackets that come off from within the box and can be hinged back to be able to get to the speakers. And the lighting rails themselves can actually be taken off or raised or lowered or adjusted. So in that way, it solved the problem, and it still allows you to get just about most of the lighting positions that you would have got from the old Pros booms. The other thing that's been mentioned in the previous commentary is the Amphitheater, which is down here at the front of the circle, the front of the gallery. That had previously in the 80s been turned into a technical box, a bit like you can see in the slips at the sides there. That came all the way around, and obviously was a big division between the gallery and the rest of the theatre, and also the seats and the sight lines there are it's very good positions. So the question was, where would all those lights go? It was a very important lighting position all the way around there, and that was solved by again balcony front lighting rails, but also a high level lighting rail. There'd previously been a lighting rail, but on the bottom of that triangular bit of ceiling, which was very difficult to access, and as would that be difficult to access if you were using ladders and things like that. So we put in this thing which doesn't sit particularly well in terms of the architecture and the restoration, but actually it does surprisingly disappear more than it may appear to do on that photograph. The focus bridge, which there's a shot from behind, which basically comes down to just above the seats, and you can climb on and you can go up and then focus the lights in front. So completely automated with a pendant control you just plug in on the wall over there on a pile wind winch. Speed up a bit, I think I'm taking too much time. There's a detail of the typical lighting rail, which was basically powder-coated support structure with a stainless steel lighting rail. And they actually do disappear quite well into the plasterwork. If there's nothing rigged and you're looking from the stage, they don't detract as much as possible some of the options might have done. We've looked at that before, the box. The other big thing that we did is the lift system, and this did involve a little bit of industrial archaeology all of its own. So in the 1970s, and as was not included obviously in 1901 on the Matcham drawings, they put in 2 pit lifts and built a seat storage area underneath the stalls here. But for some strange reason that we still don't really have an answer for, the lift at the front, the upstage lift, was not installed. So there was a big permanent gap between the front rows and the stage. So this project was the opportunity to put that lift in, and obviously it's a very useful lift because it allows you to get up to stage level, load the pit, take other things down for storage down to pit level, etc., etc. And it also gave the opportunity for another row of seats, in that row of seats that you can see erected there actually fold into the top of the lift. That's why that lift appears to be such a high profile top on it. So that was a new lift. The two lifts at the back here were the existing screwjack lifts that we refurbished, and I think learnt from this project that it's probably not worth attempting to refurbish screwjack lifts, because when they came to actually take it all apart, because obviously it's changing the motor, the drive system is a simple thing, putting a new control system on is fine, and they'd been running up and down perfectly well, but when the theatre was handed over to us in the April, just before the dark period, they were operating them by putting screwdrivers into the contactors in the control panel. So, and there was this myth, which was the truth, that they were supposed to be able to come up to stage level, but nobody had ever done that for many, many years. Anyway, to cut a long story short, in taking them apart, we did eventually find that some of the caissons were actually full of water up to about 2 meters. And some of the screw cases are completely rusted away, and the screws themselves looked like, the bottoms of the screws looked like they had been at the bottom of the North Sea for a good 30 years. So we had to replace a couple of those, and we had to limit the travel. The lifts are now limited between stalls and seat storage level. But it was quite interesting that all of the screwjacks and gearboxes still had their original Holroyd tags on them. And Holroyd, which is now Reynolds, or Reynolds have taken Holroyd over, actually did have the original design drawings for those screws. So we were actually able to remanufacture them and replace the ones that needed to be replaced. But by the time you weigh in the cost of all of that, it would have been simpler to do what we've done on the front lift, which is just to take them out and put a Serapit system in. That's what the lift pit looked like before we started, the two existing lifts and a void. That's the new Serapit mechanism for the new front lift. That's the refurbished lift pit with new motorisation. You can see there are 2 screwjacks missing. See at that point in the picture, because we had to have a temporary situation where we linked both lifts together so that the theatre could continue to operate after the dark period whilst we waited for the 2 new screwjacks to be made. That's load testing of the lift. That's the control system. So it's a control system that we've developed with Kinesis that we've put in 3 or 4 different venues now, which, touch wood, seems to be pretty foolproof, pretty reliable, and does everything that everybody wants it to do in terms of being able to do pit changes quickly, late at night, and be out on a changeover. So that's the Orchestra Pit Row. This actually did take us into David's territory a little bit. And then we had to come up, obviously you saw there's 3 pit lifts there, and in fact what you couldn't see on those photographs is there's an extra format where part of the middle lift actually gets left behind at Orchestra Pit level to allow you to have an intermediate format. So there's 5 different formats of seats. So there's an awful lot of orchestra rail formats in terms of going around the sides and across the stage and plugging into wagons, plugging into the stalls. But how do you reconcile that with the Matcham original in 1901, which obviously was a fixed orchestra pit rail, which looked something a bit like that brasswork there, but which obviously has to change every time that you have a different format in. So what these consist of is a fairly conventional wedge lock from steel deck socketed panel system, roughly about 1.5 meters wide, but with quite a few specials. And then a specially made piece of brass from an archaic manufacturer in Lancashire, straight out of the Victorian era, bolted onto the front of it, slightly brought forward and a valance behind to try and solve that problem of how do you get a modular orchestra pit rail system that looks like it did in 1901. That's just a quick photograph to show you, as with many of these projects in crinkly old buildings, there are access issues. So we had to put in systems to be able to bring the new lift parts in using the truss there, the get-ins off to the stage left, and also to take things up to do the gallery bridge up the outside of the building with a hastily erected crane system, which the builders also found very useful. As you can see there, piles of insulation and plasterboard that came up. And if anybody wants to have a summary of all of that, I've got some leaflets you can take away and answer questions afterwards.
Brilliant. Just to follow on a little bit from what Mark was saying and give you a bit more detail and background about the technical design that Charcoalblue did from kind of day one and the brief of the project, really. So prior to the project, as Mark said, there was an awful lot of temporary rigging in, and the technical staff at the venue had to work very, very hard changing this around. It took a lot of time, and it wasn't terribly efficient. So one of the main parts of our brief was working with the technical staff at the theatre to look at the rigging positions, the methods, the lighting positions required, and the infrastructure to facilitate them in terms of audio tie lines and lighting Ethernet and DMX and fibre optic, to look at what we could do to make this better whilst balancing against the demands of Dr. Dave and keeping this sympathetic to the aesthetic of the building. This is a sectional drawing from one of our design development folios, just to give you an idea of some of the bits that Mark has already mentioned. You can see the orchestra pit lifts there, and as he mentioned, there are actually kind of 3.5 to make a multitude of different configurations, which is actually quite a clever piece of engineering by Unusual, and we set them rather a hard problem to design that, and they solved it very, very well. In addition, we've talked about the box lighting positions, and Mark missed out that we've also got a series of chain hoists up in the roof void, neatly hidden away to serve advanced truss positions and also speaker hanging positions for line arrays and clusters. In addition, we've got the balcony front lighting bars as mentioned, and the gallery focusing bridge as well, which the crew love and make life very, very easy when you want to go up and change a gel. Just to fly through, in the design process, there was a period of prototyping that had to be done, really. Everything from a bit of scaffolding, mocking up the lighting position up in the gallery, through to prototyping the balcony front bars to make sure we really did get this right. And not only did it aesthetically work, but that it also suited the technical requirements of a #1 touring house. These are just a few kind of the finished article photos. We've seen a couple already. Whiz through. And really, that's about it. Just to say, it's been a fantastic process, and everyone worked very, very hard, from the decorators, the painters, Unusual rigging, audio light systems, the whole of the design team, Newcastle Theatre Row. And I think what they've ended up with is a refurbished venue that really complements its history and its origins, but also has the future capability to serve and cater for the various demands of future productions and the current tours that are going in. So in conclusion, I'd like to say I think it's vital as an industry we continue to look at these historic venues and the way in which we can marry technology and facilities with the aesthetics of these buildings. And I welcome any questions. Thank you very much. No questions? There we go.